Okay, let's see if the video should be working. Great. So I selected Ellen's graph for this analysis, this visual analysis project, which was one of the 3 graphs presented on that page. The 3 graphs that were presented were pretty much telling the same story, how the implementation of the DRL would have an effect on the number of responses per minute. It seemed like the 3 students on this page had been requesting too much attention from the teacher, and he or she was going to implement the DRL strategies to lower those behaviors to an acceptable level. So she used the DRL. DRLs are used to reduce the frequency of behavior, but not to eliminate it. So what I'm going to do is present the Ellen graph as you see it up there on your screen, and go through each of the areas on the peer review form and kind of mention the title, then explain the analysis under that title, so you're able to go through that peer review form and kind of identify versus just having a conversation about the graph without doing so. So what was the purpose of the study? The purpose of the study was to implement the independent variable, which is the DRL, the differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, on Ellen, who seemed to be requesting too much attention from her teacher. Her responses per minute were just too high for the teacher. So DV is the responses per minute, and the IV is the implementation of the DRL. So the reason why the DRL was implemented is to decrease the rate of requesting attention. So the DRL treatment was introduced to reduce that rate. I'm repeating myself. So if we're going to say what is the purpose, then the purpose is what is the effect of the differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, the DRL, on the rate of requesting attention, which is the responses per minute from the teacher. So that was the purpose of the study, if that was clear. What is the type of research design? It's a reversal design. It's an AB design, where A, if you look at it, is the baseline where the behavior was measured as is. B is the DRL intervention that was implemented. This is when the contingent reinforcement implementation was provided for the desired attention behavior. You can see that the DRL level set by the teacher is much lower than, and that's that horizontal line across your graph there, and it's lower than the baseline, established baseline. And then it was reversed or removed from the DRL implementation was reversed or removed, and baseline was measured again, and DRL was then implemented, and you see that 4th phase. So definitely an AB design. And it looks like the implementation of DRL was identical to the first. So this is my explanation why it is a AB design. Now I'm going to interpret the baseline responding, so you have 2 baselines there, and describe the data within the phase. So the baseline data points, I noted that there were 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it says you have to have 5 to 7 data points, but I note that there's at least 5 in each of those phases. Once there was a steady rate or predictable pattern, then the implementation of the DRL intervention was done. Like I said, the implementation of the intervention was to decrease the rate of requesting attention. So DRL was introduced when the DV was trending up, as you can see both baselines. Now I'm going to talk about the same baselines in regards to level, trend, and variability. So levels in the 4 phases. That is the levels of responding according to the graph. So the baseline indicates high levels of responding, and then there's low levels of responding in the DRL when it's implemented, and then there's high levels of responding again in the second baseline phase, and then it goes down to almost nil or to 0 in the 4th phase. Trend is a direction of the data path, and you need 3 data points for a trend. I note that there's an upward trend in that first baseline phase, and then as well as in the second baseline phase, and I just simply connected the first and last dots in order to make that call. In the intervention phases, even though I'm talking about baseline in this section, in the intervention phases, you can almost see that there's low to no trend occurring. Variability is how much the data points are spread. And looking at that baseline phase, I found that the rate of responding for the first data point is 0.35 and the high is a 0.55. So I'm going to say there's a high variability between those points. And then the second one, again, when I do the same thing, she's almost at a 0.25 second baseline. And then when I look further up, I'll connect the last dot, I can see that there's a change or a big difference between those points, those measurement points, those data points. And if that's my understanding of variability, then I'm also going to say there's a high variability in those two baseline phases. Okay, trend. There's an upward trend. Yes, there's an upward trend. Okay. Looking at my notes. Yeah, so the DRL have low variabilities indicating stability. Excuse me for that moment. I was looking at my notes. So high variability, low variability, high, and so on. So during baseline, Ellen's mean rate of requesting attention was 0.45 if you calculate that. And then after the introduction, she maintained a rate of requesting below the 0.15 responses. And then when she returned to baseline, when her behavior returned to baseline, the rates eventually increased and were consistent with the previous baseline if you compare the two baselines. And the second treatment phase resulted in almost 0 responses per minute, very little, falling below that DRL line, that horizontal line that was established, seemed to have been established by the teacher. All right, prediction. Prediction. When the implementation of the DRL intervention occurred, there was a change in the responding in the dependent variable, and that's evident from the graph. You look at the baseline and DRL phase. So if you look at the graph between the first baseline and the implementation, and then again if you look at the baseline and the second intervention, you can absolutely tell that the dependent variable changed. Therefore, a prediction can be made that there will be an effect attributed to the independent variable, that's the DRL, as indicated by that data path that you see across the 4 phases. A prediction can also be made that the dependent variable will remain the same if nothing is changed or implemented, but in this case there was change. So I was able to make a prediction based off those baselines that they would be changed once the DRL was implemented. Simply there was a predictable effect because there was change. Prediction is response or change in the DV, and we want to see if the DV is either remaining the same or it's changing when the implementation of the intervention happens. And like I just said, there was change. Verification. Verification is the confirmation that the dependent variable is changing because of the IV, the independent variable, which is the DRL. So a baseline phase was completed and an intervention was introduced, and you can immediately see that the IV had an effect, which allowed us to make the prediction as well if you compare the baseline to the DRL in those first and second phases. And so that prediction said there would be a change in the data path within the next phase change. And you can see this across Ellen's graph across the phases. So verification is satisfied because as the changes came about, because of the intervention of the independent variable, so because of that change, verification was satisfied. When the intervention stopped, you can see that Ellen's responding returned back to its previous baseline condition. So not only was prediction satisfied as explained earlier, but verification was also satisfied in Allen's graph because there's an immediacy of change from the baseline to the DRL and again from baseline to DRL. All right, now I'm going to report on the responding between adjacent phases and describe the verification as the change in level, trend, variability, immediacy, and overlap. So looking across the four phases, the AB, and doing the visual analysis that I'm doing, as you can see, I do see that there's a change level. When you look at that baseline phase, you look at the intervention phase, it goes high, low, and these are just the levels of responding, of Allen's responding. And trend, there is an upward trend in both baselines. Again, if I connect the first and last points of data, you can see that. In the intervention phases, there's definitely low to no trend. Variability also exists. As I reported earlier, when you look at that first point and the last point in the baseline, there is a high variability, and the DRLs had low variabilities. Immediacy of effect. There's an immediate effect when the DRL intervention is put in place, as you can see. If you look at the data points in the second phase, which is the intervention phase, they're significantly at 0.1 responses per minute or lower, with 1 or 2 data points at 0. Yes, 2 data points at 0. There's also immediacy shown when the intervention is removed. So if you look at that data point increase in the second baseline after removing the intervention, you can absolutely see that increase. Overlap is the degree to which data is the same in adjacent phases, and that means there's an overlap from one phase to another. And so if I look at the baseline phase and the treatment phase, I don't see an overlap at all. So I'm going to say overlap does not exist. Replication, number 7. Because this is an AB design, replication and therefore functional control is demonstrated between the dependent variable and the independent variable. So if this was just an AB design, then there would be no demonstration of replication and therefore no functional relationship would have been established. But in this case, definitely replication exists as the intervention was removed and then reintroduced to replicate previous responding. You can see that when the DRL intervention was removed, the responses per minute went back up or replicated in the baseline level. Therefore, I'm going to say that replication was demonstrated and it also demonstrates functional control. So the last question was functional control demonstrated? Yes. Functional control is demonstrated in Allen's graph because the 3 effects are shown across the full data set, as I described earlier. So there's predictability, there's verification, and there's replication. When we look at the active manipulation of that independent variable, that DRL, we see that there's an effect happening across the phases. And again, this leads to functional relationship, that there's one that exists. For replication to occur, an experimenter needs to show replication of previous responding, and if you look at Allen's graph, this is quite evident. So the intervention was removed and the responding went back down to 0 to 10%, which when you look at Allen's graph, and I'm sorry to keep repeating that, it is definitely happening. So change in Allen's graph, the change went back to the baseline level and changed again when intervention was implemented. Immediacy exists. It's quite evident in that, like I explained earlier, and there's a consistency of the data pattern between the baseline and the implementation of the DRL. So based on all that, I'm going to say functional control was demonstrated. So just to repeat very quickly, I stated the purpose of the study, the type of research design. I interpreted the baseline responding the best way I could, and I described the data across the phases. I talked specifically about Allen's graph and her mean rate of requesting attention across the graph. I talked about prediction, verification, and number 6, I talked about responding between the adjacent phases in regards to level, trend, variability, immediacy, and overlap. And number 7 was asking us to talk about replication, which I just did. and the last question was functional control demonstrated. I'm going to play this back and see that I did